Army Rangers challenged Tomb Guard. One shot silenced them all. It was a bright and clear morning at Arlington National Cemetery. The soft rustle of leaves from the trees around the hallowed grounds filled the air. At the center of it all stood the tomb of the unknown soldier, a sight of deep reverence and respect. The guards who stood at the tomb were not just soldiers. They were chosen for their precision, discipline, and unwavering dedication to a duty that few could truly understand. The tomb guard's responsibility was one of great honor. Every single movement had to be perfectly timed. The guards, trained for years in rigorous discipline, marched back and forth in front of the tomb, ensuring that not a single misstep was made. Their uniforms were immaculate, and their shoes glistened in the sunlight. Their focus was absolute, their demeanor calm and composed. The world around them could be chaotic, but nothing ever seemed to distract them from their post. It was during one of these solemn watch hours that a new challenge would be set into motion. A group of Army Rangers, men who were also known for their elite training and high standards, stood nearby. They had watched the guards at the tomb for some time. It was clear that the tomb guards' dedication and discipline were unparalleled, but as seasoned Army Rangers, they could not help but feel the need to prove themselves. They were not ones to back down from any challenge, no matter how difficult or intimidating. The Rangers had heard stories about the tomb guard and their remarkable training. They had seen the unwavering precision with which the guards performed their duties. But in the back of their minds, they couldn't help but wonder, could they do it too? They respected the tomb guard's commitment, but they were known for their abilities, skills honed under the toughest of circumstances. Could their own training, their own discipline, match the tomb guard's legendary focus? One of the Rangers, an experienced leader named Sergeant Harris, could not shake the thought. "I bet we could do that," he said, speaking loud enough for his men to hear. The other Rangers looked at him, intrigued. Harris had always been known for his sharp mind and his ability to tackle any challenge head-on. The challenge now wasn't just physical, it was a test of their own resolve and focus. The idea began to grow among them. It wasn't enough to simply admire the tomb guard's skills. They wanted to show that their training, too, could match the discipline and precision required for such a task. They discussed it quietly, exchanging looks and opinions. Each man had a different perspective, but there was one thing they all agreed on. They were up for the challenge. The Rangers approached the tomb guard with respect. They weren't looking to be disrespectful. They simply wanted to see if they could match the legendary focus and control that the tomb guard displayed every day. It wasn't an easy thing to ask. These men had been guarding the tomb for years, and they took their duty very seriously. They had a deep respect for the soldiers who walked that path before them, and the Rangers knew they had to approach the situation delicately. As they walked up to one of the guards, Sergeant Harris took a deep breath and said, "We've been watching you all, and we've got to say we respect what you do here. We think we might be able to try our hand at it. We want to see if we can match your level of focus and precision." "What do you say?" The tomb guard stood still for a moment. The challenge was clear, but the guard's response was calm and measured. "This is not something that can be taken lightly," the guard replied. "Our duty here is sacred. It takes years of training and commitment to be able to stand guard, to march with this level of precision. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility?" Sergeant Harris nodded. "We're ready. We know what it takes to push ourselves to the limits. We're not here to disrespect you. We just want to see if we can handle it." The tomb guard didn't respond immediately, his face impassive. The challenge wasn't something to take lightly, but the respect in Sergeant Harris's voice was enough to make him consider it. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "All right, we'll let you try. But remember, this is not about proving one group better than the other. It's about discipline, focus, and respect for the responsibility we carry here. If you choose to take on this challenge, you must understand that it requires the utmost respect for the sacred ground you will be walking on." The Rangers nodded solemnly. They understood the weight of the task. It wasn't just about proving their skills. It was about showing that they could respect the tradition and the duty that came with standing at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The challenge was set. The Army Rangers would now be tasked with demonstrating their focus, discipline, and precision. But they would also be required to show the respect that the tomb guard had earned through years of training and sacrifice. They would need to prove that their training was as exacting and as rigorous as that of the tomb guard. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The tomb guard and the rangers stood across from each other, preparing for the challenge. There was a quiet tension in the air, a sense of anticipation. Both groups were ready. The tomb guard, with their years of unwavering commitment, and the rangers, with their elite training and skill, would now face off. But more than anything, they knew that this challenge would be about much more than just skill. It would be about discipline, focus, and respect for one another's abilities. The clock was ticking. The challenge was about to begin. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet cemetery. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood solemn and unmoving, as it always had, a symbol of sacrifice and remembrance. But today, the air around the tomb was charged with a different kind of energy. The Army Rangers were preparing themselves for a challenge, and the tomb guard was standing firm, as still and unyielding as the tomb itself. Sergeant Harris stood with his men, his eyes scanning the area in front of them. His mind was racing. They had trained for this. They had faced intense situations, from grueling physical tests to combat missions in far-off lands. But nothing compared to what they were about to do. This wasn't a mission that involved fighting an enemy or securing a target. It wasn't about tactics or weaponry. This was a test of mental strength, of discipline, precision, and patience. It was about standing still, focused, and unshaken in a way they had never been tested before. The tomb guard, who had been watching them closely, remained silent, his face expressionless. To an outsider, it might have looked like a simple standoff between two groups of soldiers, but to those involved, it was much more than that. It was a battle of wills. The Army Rangers knew what they were capable of. They had been trained to handle the toughest conditions, to adapt to any situation, and to never back down. They had seen and experienced things that most could only imagine. But as they looked at the tomb guard, they realized this was something entirely different. The guard was not here to prove his strength in battle, but to show something much more profound: the power of stillness, discipline, and unwavering commitment. "You ready?" Sergeant Harris asked his men, his voice steady but filled with the adrenaline of the moment. One of the Rangers, Private Mitchell, gave a brief nod. He had been with Harris on many missions, and if anyone was excited about this challenge, it was him. He thrived under pressure. But there was something about this challenge that made him feel the weight of the moment in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was about something deeper, something intangible. "We've got this," Harris said, sensing the nerves of his team but also feeling the same pressure. They were trained to push their limits, but this would be something unlike anything they had ever done before. The Rangers took their positions, aligning themselves in a straight line in front of the tomb guard. The ground beneath them was firm, and the cemetery was eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The tomb guard did not move. His posture was perfect, his uniform pristine. He was a symbol of unwavering dedication. His eyes never strayed from the spot he had been trained to guard, and his face remained as expressionless as ever. There was no arrogance, no sign of impatience, just quiet, perfect focus. Sergeant Harris took a step forward, his eyes locked on the tomb guard. "We've been trained for moments like this," he thought to himself. But as he looked at the guard, a sense of respect washed over him. This was not a competition in the traditional sense. It was a test of focus, of maintaining control under pressure. The tomb guard's calmness seemed almost unearthly, and Harris couldn't help but feel the challenge was about to push him and his team to the limits of their own discipline. "Let's go," Harris said, signaling the start of the challenge. The Rangers took their first steps, each movement carefully planned and deliberate. They knew the rules. They were to march across the area with the same precision and discipline that the tomb guard showed every day. There could be no missteps, no hesitation. Every action had to be as calculated as a heartbeat. Private Mitchell took his first step, his boots clicking lightly against the stone pathway. The other Rangers followed in perfect formation. They marched with purpose, but each of them felt the weight of the challenge in their legs. The feeling of eyes upon them, the knowledge that the tomb guard's watchful gaze never wavered, made it difficult to focus. But they pushed through it. Every step had to be flawless. The tomb guard watched them closely, his eyes flicking from one Ranger to the next. He had seen many attempts before, but something about this group of men was different. They were determined, yes, but they were also beginning to realize the true meaning of their task. It was not about simply matching the tomb guard's movements. It was about understanding the quiet strength that lay in the ability to remain still, to remain true to one's duty without the need for recognition or reward. The Rangers continued to march, but the longer they walked, the more they began to feel the pressure. Each step felt heavier. The discipline required was unlike anything they had experienced in their normal training. They had trained in high-pressure situations, but this was different. There were no guns to fire, no targets to hit. There was only stillness, and in that stillness they realized how difficult it was to stay focused. As they continued, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees around them. The sound of the breeze was the only thing that seemed to break the silence. But that silence, that perfect, unbroken silence, was the very thing that tested them. After a few minutes, Sergeant Harris felt the strain in his legs. His muscles began to ache, his mind began to wander, and he felt the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. But he didn't let it show. He had to keep going. He had to push through, not just for himself, but for his men. He glanced at the tomb guard, who was still standing perfectly still. It was clear now that the challenge wasn't just about completing the march. It was about the mental toughness required to endure. Private Mitchell, too, was feeling the strain. His breathing had slowed, and he could feel his body beginning to tire. But he couldn't let it show. He had trained for this moment, and he would not let it defeat him. He kept his eyes on the tomb guard, who showed no sign of fatigue. The tomb guard's discipline was a quiet reminder of the kind of resolve they had yet to master. Sergeant Harris stopped for a moment, glancing back at his men. They were still moving, but their steps had become slower, more deliberate. Harris knew that they had passed the point where physical strength alone could carry them. Now, it was about mental resilience. It was about showing that they could endure the discomfort, the fatigue, and the challenge of remaining focused when everything in them wanted to falter. "We're not stopping," Harris muttered to himself. "Not until we get this right." The tomb guard's gaze never shifted. He continued to watch them, a silent observer. He knew what they were going through, the inner battle of pushing through the fatigue, of staying true to the discipline required of them. But he also knew that this was not something that could be easily won. This challenge would test them in ways they couldn't yet understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the moment came. Harris felt a shift in the air. He glanced at his men and saw the same realization flash across their faces. They had done it. They had made it through the march, each step taken with precision, even if it hadn't been perfect. The test had been difficult, but it was not over. The challenge was far from finished. But for now, the Rangers stood still, their chests rising and falling with exertion. The tomb guard, ever watchful, stood silent, his expression unchanged. The sun had now completely set, and the cemetery, with its rows of headstones, took on a calm, almost ethereal glow from the lights that lit the area. It was a sight that filled the heart with reverence and respect. The tomb of the unknown soldier, as always, stood in the center, majestic and solemn. It was surrounded by the heavy silence of the cemetery, a silence that carried with it a deep sense of history and honor. But tonight, the silence was punctuated by the tension of the challenge that had unfolded before the two groups. Sergeant Harris stood still, his muscles aching from the physical strain of the march. He glanced at his men, each of them holding their ground, trying their best to focus. Their breathing was steady, but it was clear that they were tired. The stillness, the precision, the mental discipline, it was all more demanding than they had expected. For the Army Rangers, known for their tough training, this was an entirely different kind of test. They had faced physical challenges, combat situations, and high-stakes operations. But this challenge, testing their ability to remain focused and disciplined without action or external stimuli, was something entirely new. The tomb guard, however, stood as still as ever. His eyes moved only slightly as he observed the Rangers. He showed no signs of fatigue or discomfort. His uniform remained immaculate, every fold and crease perfect. His posture remained rigid, unyielding. It was a sight that, despite their own confidence, made the Rangers question the limits of their own training. The tomb guard wasn't just standing in front of them. He was embodying the very concept of discipline, patience, and respect. For Sergeant Harris, the challenge was no longer just about proving their own skill or showing off their training. It was about understanding a new level of commitment. They had come to prove something, but what they were starting to realize was that they had to first understand the kind of strength it took to carry out such a duty. It was a lesson that wasn't one with pride or ego, but with humility and understanding. As they stood in place, Sergeant Harris couldn't help but respect the tomb guard more with each passing second. It wasn't that they hadn't known the level of commitment required. It was that they had underestimated just how much it took. The silence between them was heavy, but it was also powerful. Neither side spoke, and yet everything was being communicated. The Rangers were learning the quiet power of control and resolve. Then, as the last rays of daylight disappeared and darkness settled in fully, the challenge shifted. The next part of the challenge wasn't about walking in formation or holding still. It was about something deeper. Sergeant Harris motioned to his men with a slight gesture, signaling that it was time to take it further. They had been moving in unison, marching across the path with the strictest discipline, but now the Rangers had to prove something else. It wasn't about going through the motions. It was about one single, focused action. It was about proving, once and for all, if they had the ability to control themselves in a way that matched the calm and stoic nature of the tomb guard. Harris stepped forward slightly, motioning to one of his men, Private Mitchell. The two locked eyes, and Harris gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Mitchell understood what it meant. It was time to make the shot. There was no room for error. The challenge was to see if they could silence the tomb guard with one perfect, precise shot. It wasn't a shot of weaponry, but a shot that would prove the Rangers' discipline. This shot was meant to be an act of perfection, a demonstration of the mental strength required to not just follow the rules, but to understand the true meaning of the challenge. As Mitchell stepped forward, there was a soft rustling in the leaves around them. The wind had picked up, and for the briefest moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The tension was so thick that it felt almost tangible, as if the air itself was charged with the weight of what was about to unfold. Mitchell raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and then brought it down in a sharp, controlled motion. The sound of his hand slicing through the air was clear and crisp, cutting through the stillness like a sharp knife. It echoed briefly across the cemetery. To the Rangers, it felt like the final moment of the challenge. This single action, this one motion, was everything they had been training for. There would be no more chances. This was their one shot at proving themselves. For the tomb guard, the shot had no meaning. He had been prepared for any test, any challenge. He had seen men come and go, trying to prove themselves. But for him, there was only one thing that mattered: maintaining the silence and discipline that had defined the tomb guard for so long. He didn't need to react to the challenge. He simply needed to remain steadfast, unwavering. The Rangers watched intently, waiting for the response. But there was none. The tomb guard did not flinch, did not even acknowledge the motion. He simply stood still, his eyes locked ahead, unwavering. The silence remained, undisturbed by any outside noise. Sergeant Harris felt a mix of awe and frustration. They had given their best, but the tomb guard had proven that their best was still not enough. There was no need for showy displays of force or bravado. The tomb guard stood, a living testament to the quiet strength that came from true discipline. Harris, in that moment, understood something far deeper than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about doing it consistently, with focus, without needing recognition. Mitchell lowered his hand slowly, the frustration of the challenge beginning to fade into something else: respect. The challenge wasn't over. They still had much to prove to themselves. But in that moment, they realized the true measure of the tomb guard wasn't in how well they performed or how skilled they were. It was in the power of their quiet resolve. As Harris looked at the tomb guard, he felt a deep respect for the man standing before them. It wasn't about who had won or lost. It was about understanding what it took to stand at that tomb and maintain the silence, the reverence, and the discipline that came with it. The tomb guard had already won, not through force, not through skill, but through something much more powerful: the ability to remain unmoved, to stand in perfect stillness, and to do so day after day without wavering. The Rangers stood there, silent for a moment, processing what had just occurred. The challenge had not gone the way they had expected, but it had taught them something more valuable than any victory. It had shown them that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in action, but in the ability to remain steadfast and true to one's purpose. The tomb guard did not speak. He did not need to. His very presence was enough to teach the lesson. Sergeant Harris slowly nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson they had learned. They would leave the challenge behind, but the respect they had gained for the tomb guard and what they stood for would stay with them forever. The cool evening air swept gently through Arlington National Cemetery, its breeze almost a whisper against the rows of white tombstones. The quiet surrounding the tomb of the unknown soldier was thick, heavy with meaning. Despite the challenge and the adrenaline that had pulsed through the Rangers' veins just moments before, a deep silence now settled over them. It was a silence of reflection, a silence that seemed to stretch on for much longer than it should. Sergeant Harris stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the tomb guard. The man had not moved an inch, not even after the motion from the Rangers. It wasn't just that the tomb guard had succeeded in holding his ground. It was that he had shown the Rangers something far more profound than they could have expected. It was the power of unwavering discipline, of an inner strength that didn't need to prove itself to anyone. Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of humility, something he wasn't used to. He was the leader of this group of elite soldiers, men who had survived the toughest missions, the most extreme conditions. Yet here, in the face of the tomb guard, he felt a humbling recognition that there was a level of strength that transcended physical endurance. The Rangers, in their quest to challenge the tomb guard, had learned that true strength often came from within, not from outward displays, but from the ability to remain unshaken, no matter the circumstances. The Rangers had expected to prove themselves, to show that they could match the tomb guard's precision and focus. But now, as they stood silently in the cemetery, it was clear that the tomb guard had already proven his point. He had nothing to prove to them. The stillness and calm that he exuded were enough to show the kind of commitment that few, even the Rangers, could truly understand. Private Mitchell stood beside Sergeant Harris, his eyes still trained on the tomb guard. He had felt the frustration during the challenge. His body had ached and his mind had screamed for release, for movement, for action. But as the seconds passed, that frustration began to fade. He realized that the true test had never been about how fast they could move or how hard they could push. It had been about focus, about control, about quiet perseverance. The tomb guard had shown them that even the smallest of movements, when executed with perfect discipline, carried more weight than the loudest of actions. The Rangers had all gathered together now, forming a loose circle around Sergeant Harris. There was no need for words at first. They stood together, processing what had just happened. They had been pushed to their limits, not in terms of strength or endurance, but in mental fortitude. The realization began to dawn on them. They had been trained to fight, to survive in harsh conditions, but they hadn't been trained to stand still in the face of something as immovable as the tomb guard. Harris was the first to speak, breaking the silence that had settled over them. His voice was calm, measured, but there was a new depth to it, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. "I've never faced anything like this," he said, his words slowly sinking into the minds of his men. "We're always pushing ourselves to the edge, but this is different. The guard didn't have to prove anything. He didn't need to make a move or show us anything. His strength is in his stillness." Private Mitchell nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about doing more, it's about doing what's necessary and holding the line, no matter what." The other Rangers stood silently, absorbing Mitchell's words. The tomb guard had demonstrated something that none of them had fully appreciated before. It wasn't enough to be physically strong, to be able to perform well in a firefight or run a marathon. The true strength, the strength that the tomb guard represented, was in restraint. In control, in the ability to endure without showing weakness. As the group continued to reflect on what had just transpired, Sergeant Harris took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the tomb guard. The challenge may have been over, but the lesson was just beginning to take root. It was one that would stay with him and his men for years to come. "You're right," Harris said, his voice quiet but filled with new understanding. "This challenge wasn't about winning. It was about learning. We came here thinking we were going to prove something to them, but instead, we've learned something about ourselves." The tomb guard, of course, remained silent, his presence calm and unwavering. He hadn't moved an inch throughout the entire challenge, but that in itself was the most powerful statement. The Rangers, in their attempt to prove their skills, had learned a lesson in discipline, in patience, and in the value of stillness. They had been shown that the greatest strength sometimes comes not from action, but from the ability to remain grounded, unshaken, in the face of everything around you. As the final rays of daylight disappeared, the Rangers began to walk away from the tomb guard, their steps slower now, more thoughtful than before. There was no cheering, no celebration. They hadn't won the challenge, but they had gained something much more valuable: respect for the tomb guard, for their own abilities, and for the concept of discipline in its purest form. The Rangers didn't talk much as they walked back toward their camp. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, reflecting on the challenge. There was a new sense of humility among them. They had seen the tomb guard as another group to challenge, another test to pass. But in the end, it was clear that the true test was not about who was stronger or who could perform better. It was about understanding the deeper meaning of what it meant to stand firm, to remain disciplined, and to serve a purpose greater than oneself. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows a deep understanding. They had learned something about themselves that day, and they had learned something about the tomb guard too. They had learned that sometimes silence and stillness spoke louder than words ever could. As they reached the edge of the cemetery, Sergeant Harris turned to face his men one last time. "We'll remember this. We'll carry this with us. The lesson from the tomb guard is one that we'll never forget." And with that, the Rangers continued their walk, the memory of their challenge at Arlington National Cemetery now a part of their own story. The lesson of the tomb guard would stay with them forever, a reminder of the strength found in silence, discipline, and the unwavering resolve to stand firm. As the Rangers walked away from the tomb guard, a sense of quiet reverence filled the air. The sun had fully set, and the evening sky was now a deep shade of blue, dotted with stars. The stillness of the cemetery had returned, but it wasn't the same as before. The weight of the challenge hung in the air, a silent reminder of what had transpired. The Rangers, though tired and worn, felt something inside them shift. They had come to prove themselves, but instead, they had learned a far more important lesson. The final moments with the tomb guard had not been about victory or defeat. It had not been about demonstrating physical prowess or skill. What they had witnessed was something much deeper, a quiet power, a strength that was not built on external displays, but on a foundation of discipline, focus, and commitment. The tomb guard had stood in front of them, unmoving, unshaken, showing them what true resolve looked like. And in doing so, he had shown the Rangers a new way of thinking about strength. Sergeant Harris walked at the front of the group, his mind racing as he replayed the events in his head. The challenge, while difficult, had opened his eyes to something more profound than he had expected. He had been focused on one goal: to prove that the Army Rangers were just as disciplined and focused as the tomb guard. But in the end, he realized that the true test wasn't about matching the tomb guard's movements or precision. It was about understanding the depth of commitment required to perform such a sacred duty. The tomb guard had shown them that discipline was not just about doing something perfectly in a moment. It was about doing it every single day, without fail, no matter the circumstances. "I've never seen anything like it," Harris said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, as if the words themselves carried the understanding of the lesson they had learned. Private Mitchell, who had been quiet for much of the walk, finally spoke up. "I don't think we'll ever truly understand what it's like to stand in their shoes, the way they hold themselves. It's not just about physical training. It's about something deeper. They don't just perform their duty, they live it." The other Rangers nodded in agreement. There was no excitement, no bragging rights. They weren't walking away from this challenge with a feeling of triumph. Instead, they were walking away with something far more valuable: a new sense of respect for the tomb guard and for the kind of discipline that went beyond what they had known. They understood now that the true strength of the tomb guard wasn't something that could be measured with weapons or tactics. It was a strength that came from within, from a deep, unshakable commitment to a purpose that was bigger than any individual. As they walked through the cemetery, Sergeant Harris glanced back one last time at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The guard was still standing there, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on the sacred monument. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a small, simple gesture, one person standing still at attention. But to the Rangers, it was everything. They had just witnessed the embodiment of discipline, a discipline that didn't require applause or recognition. It was a silent commitment that had been carried out by men and women for generations, and it would continue long after they were gone. The challenge was over, but the lesson would stay with them forever. The Rangers had come to Arlington National Cemetery looking to test their own limits, but instead, they had been shown what it truly meant to be resolute. They had learned that the greatest strength was not in force, but in control, not in action, but in restraint. It wasn't about doing something grand or spectacular. It was about the quiet, unyielding dedication to a duty performed day after day without wavering. As the Rangers reached the edge of the cemetery, they paused for a moment, taking in the peaceful surroundings. The stars above twinkled in the night sky, and the cemetery was silent once more. But this time, the silence felt different. It felt respectful. It felt like the kind of silence that came after a lesson had been learned, a lesson that would never be forgotten. Sergeant Harris turned to his men, his expression calm but filled with new understanding. "What we saw today wasn't just a challenge," he said, his voice steady. "It was a reminder of what true discipline looks like. The Tomb Guard doesn't just protect the unknown, they protect the very essence of commitment. They do their duty with unwavering dedication, and that's something we can all learn from." The other Rangers nodded, the weight of Harris's words settling over them. They had faced many challenges before, but none quite like this. This was not just a physical test, it was a mental and emotional one as well. They had been forced to confront their own limitations, and in doing so, had gained a deeper appreciation for the value of quiet strength. As they made their way back to their base camp, the Rangers were no longer the same men who had arrived at Arlington that morning. They had been changed, not by the challenge itself, but by the lesson that had been silently imparted to them. The Tomb Guard had shown them that discipline wasn't about seeking recognition or proving superiority. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter how difficult, no matter how invisible the task. It was about serving a purpose greater than oneself. The Rangers knew they would carry this lesson with them for the rest of their careers, and for the rest of their lives. Every time they faced a challenge, they would remember the Tomb Guard, the man who had stood still without faltering, and who had shown them that sometimes the greatest strength lies in silence, in focus, and in the quiet power of doing one's duty with honor. As the night grew darker and the cemetery faded into the distance, the Rangers walked together, their heads held high. They had learned something that day, something they would never forget. The Tomb Guard had shown them that sometimes the hardest thing to do was not to move, but to remain standing, unwavering, disciplined, and true to the task at hand. And in that simple act, they had witnessed a strength that spoke louder than any action ever could.